If you've read Max Stirner or Friedrich Nietzsche, then you should know how irrationalism permeates atheist thought. The Bible says, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Hey, let me give you a big Northeast Tennessee welcome to the Monty Collier Report. Let me remind you that if you'd like to get a free copy of my theological journal, then send me an email to the email address you see at the beginning of this video, and I'll send one out to you free of charge. Fools are not rational individuals, they are irrational. The fool is one who proclaims himself to be wise and reasonable, when in fact he is foolish and unreasonable. When the Bible tells us that the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God, Psalm 14:1, then it infallibly is revealing to us something very important about the nature of their thought. They are hostile to the very basics of logic, and they will have none of it. An easy, all too easy example of this irrationalism can be found in the thinking of ProfMTH. In his video titled Morality Part 2, ProfMTH makes a gigantic logical mistake when he claims, and I quote, "A basic tenet of morality and ethics is the proposition ought implies can," end quote. ProfMTH makes this illogical claim at about the 3-minute mark of that particular video. Now, any introductory course in logic or grammar should have prevented ProfMTH from making this idiotic mistake. What's worse, ProfMTH actually claims to be a college professor and administrator. Regardless, it is evident that ProfMTH does not know the basic definition of a proposition. For this basic definition, let's examine the writings of Calvinist Gordon H. Clark. Dr. Gordon H. Clark was an internationally renowned philosopher, the former chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Butler University, and the author of more than 40 books. Among other things, Clark was a master logician. He gives us the basic definition of a proposition when he writes the following, and I quote, "A proposition, therefore, is defined as the meaning of a declarative sentence. Some sentences are not declarative, such as commands in the imperative mood, or exhortations in the well-nigh extinct subjunctive mood. Questions or interrogative sentences also are neither true nor false. Only declarative sentences are true or false, and it is this common character that is important for propositions." End quote. Logic, page 28. Gordon H. Clark goes on to point out that if it is not a proposition, then it, quote, "can play no part in an argument," end quote. Logic, also page 28. Since all commands are in the imperative mood, then they cannot be part of an argument. You can deduce nothing from a command. But if the testimony of one logic textbook is not enough, then consider another. Irving M. Copey writes the following in his 3rd edition, and I quote, "Inference is a process by which one proposition is reached and affirmed on the basis of one or more other propositions accepted as the starting point of the process. Propositions are either true or false, and in this they differ from questions, commands, and exclamations. Only propositions can be either asserted or denied. Questions may be asked and commands given and exclamations uttered, but none of them can be affirmed or denied or judged to be either true or false." End quote. Introduction to Logic, Chapter 1, pages 5 through 6. Like I said, this is the 3rd edition. So by definition, ought does not imply can, because ought does not imply anything. Commands are not propositions. When someone says that ought implies can, then they are claiming that a command is part of an immediate inference, and nothing could be further from the truth. But what is an immediate inference? Gordon H. Clark gives the following definition, and I quote, "An argument with one proposition as a premise and one proposition as a conclusion. There is no middle term." End quote. Logic, page 129. Continuing on the subject of immediate inference, Gordon H. Clark also states, and I quote, The simplest inference, then, must be an inference that has one proposition for a premise and one proposition for a conclusion." End quote. Logic, page 32 this time. So again, since a command is not a proposition, then it can never be part of an immediate inference. Well, this is not the first time a Bible believer has had to point out this basic logical truth to a non-believer. Martin Luther had to explain the same subject to Erasmus of Rotterdam back in the 16th century. So I will end by reading Martin Luther's famous reply to Erasmus. The reply appears in Luther's book, The Bondage of the Will. And if you haven't read this book by Luther, then you need to read it immediately, for it is one of the best books ever written on the subject of absolute predestination. Martin Luther writes the following, and I quote, "That by the words of the law man is admonished and taught, not what he can do, but what he ought to do. That is, that he may know his sin, not that he may believe that he has any strength. Wherefore, my good Erasmus, as often shall I confront you with the words of Paul, by the law is knowledge of sin, not power of will. Gather together from the big concordances all the imperative words into one chaotic heap, not the words of promise, but the words of the law and its demand. And I shall at once declare that they always show not what men can do or do, but what they should do. Even grammarians and schoolboys at the street corners know that nothing more is signified by the verbs in the imperative mood than what ought to be done, and that what is done or can be done should be expressed by verbs in the indicative. How is it that you theologians are twice as stupid as schoolboys, in that as soon as you get hold of a single imperative verb you infer an indicative meaning, as though the moment a thing is commanded it is done, or can be done? But there's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip, and things that you commanded and that were possible enough may yet not be done, so great a gulf is there between imperative and indicative statements in the simplest everyday matters. Yet in this business of keeping the law, which is as far out of our reach as heaven is from the earth, and just as impossible of attainment, you make indicatives out of imperatives with such alacrity that the moment you hear the word of command, do, keep, choose, you will straightway have it that it has been kept, done, chosen, or fulfilled, or that these things can be done by our own strength." End quote. The Bondage of the Will, Chapter 4, page 159. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this basic introduction to logic, and if you haven't read Gordon H. Clark's book, Logic, then let me just go ahead and tell you to get a copy of it as quick as possible and read it. It's a good book. You'll like it. You can get it at trinityfoundation.org. God bless.